Good day to you all. My name is Manu, and we're going to be together for a while and take a look at the Creative Writing Laboratory as we developed it and imagined it as a part of the CREAM project. Let's begin with a very brief introduction. I promise it will be brief. This is what we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about motivation, so the reason why we thought it would be a good idea to use storytelling to teach subjects that are not necessarily immediately associated with imagination. Then we're going to discuss the methodological foundations of our CWLs, and then we're going to discuss in a bit more detail its concrete applications. Let's start with the fundamental question: why? And I'll tell you a little bit about myself to start the discussion about why CWLs. As a student, I used to do very well with history. I was good at languages. I was a disaster in mathematics, and I was doing fairly poorly in science. The main reason being, when I think about it, that when I was asked to write something, I felt I could use words in any way I saw fit. I could construct sentences the way I wanted, and I could say what I wanted, as opposed to being asked to solve a mathematical problem, which in my mind was simply about finding the only possible solution in the only possible method that our teacher taught us about. In reality, things are more complicated than this, and mathematics and science and engineering can definitely be understood as a place for creativity to some extent. So the reason why I got interested in CREAM and I worked with the project is that I was hoping, together with the others, to find ways for people like me that are creative in the linguistic sense of the term, to find joy and excitement in learning about STEM subjects through storytelling in a way that normally we would not associate with it. So why exactly STEAM? Well, first, because they are part of the 21st century skills that the EU is pushing. Second, because it's an excellent way to foster metacognition. So when you learn something, in a few words, when you learn something, you can also learn something else at the same time if you set up the learning process and experience properly. The third reason would be for career. There is a strong indication that fields related to STEM subjects will be in great places for work. There will be a lot of demand of professionals that are trained in these skills, so it may be strategic for young people in particular to orient themselves towards these subjects. Technological literacy will be the fourth, and this is more related to people of a certain generation. That will be mine, for example, in the sense that young people, children, the so-called digital natives, to some extent would learn the technology simply by being immersed in it, as opposed to ourselves. We need to actually learn how things work, because back in the day, so to speak, technology wasn't there, not to the extent that it is now. So this is an opportunity to update and upgrade ourselves and understand a bit more about what the technology is available now and how it works. And of course, inclusion, in the sense that some of these fields, the STEM fields, are traditionally, let's say, chosen primarily by boys or men. There's no particular reason for things to be this way. So one thing we could certainly do is try and do our best to make sure that the field is receptive and accessible to anybody who is interested, right? Beyond any sorts of barriers one might think of. Now, let's talk specifically about storytelling. What can we get by adopting storytelling and using it as a teaching tool, as part of the learning experience? Well, one thing is that we can certainly use storytelling as a way to enhance the understanding of a certain topic, precisely because it calls upon students to use imagination and make a metacognitive effort, right? They need to try and understand something that's not just given to them, but it's given to them in a certain context. Something else that I think is a major factor is the fact that storytelling is very good for increasing engagement. So as we said, as opposed to just giving them a rule, if the rules is embedded in a context and the context is made of a story, then following a story, particularly if it's an engaging one, if it's a meaningful one, is easier and it's more exciting than simply learn a formula or a certain concept by heart. Another point would be critical thinking, because stories, if they are well crafted, will demand from the listener a certain level of reflection. So you can't just simply listen to a story and be passive. If the story is well written, or if it's well told, or if the person telling the story has set up the context properly, you're going to be encouraged to think about it and share your thoughts and share your impressions to make something of it, and that fosters critical thinking. And then, of course, creativity. So up until this point, we might have thought of being ourselves, the teachers, the professors, tutors. We might have thought of ourselves as the ones that are at the helm. So we lead and people follow, but it needs not be this way, particularly not today, and particularly when discussing certain topics with certain people, with certain, let's say, certain categories of learners who need a bit more of a flexible and engaging approach. I was fairly happy, speaking of myself, I was fairly happy of being told things so long as they were interesting, so long as the story was worth listening to. But some of my classmates would need to be actually engaged and perhaps even to be given the chance to do something physical just to keep their attention. So creativity through storytelling opens all sorts of doors to, let's call them non-traditional classroom teaching styles, which is getting increasingly important if you think about the fact that classes are now much more complicated than they used to be. There may be people from different cultural backgrounds, people from different ethnicities, from different nations, perhaps with different levels of understanding of the language, with different levels of proficiency in the language. And so there needs to be something in there for everyone to be able to participate properly. And storytelling, creativity help with that. Of course, cultural relevance, in the sense that stories can be used to highlight certain elements of a given culture, or maybe just bring something to the attention of people that up until the point they were unaware of, in a fun, interesting, creative way. And we know from research that what we learn from stories, from listening to stories or participating in stories ourselves, is actually it's easier to retain and to recall, rather than simply listening and to an explanation of your teacher, of your a standard explanation of your teacher. One big factor here too is the fact that storytelling can be used to great effect to promote interdisciplinarity, in the sense that if you take the time to actually weave the story as it might be, in a way that it's interesting and that spawns different, let's say, routes to explore different topics, you can actually hit not just one subject but multiple ones. You can bring them together inside the same story, and then students will be encouraged to know more about not just one, but multiple other subjects. And this is one critical factor in the CREAM project. We're interested in the fact that storytelling doesn't need to be just something that stays there in your imagination, then dissipates when the activity is finished, but it can be built up in such a way that it has practical, real-world applications. So it translates from theoretical to practical. Now let's discuss the what we're talking about. So, a little bit of context to start with. The way we developed CREAM is as follows. We ran a desk research to start with to see what was there already in the field of theoretical knowledge and academic research. We ran a field research ourselves and our partners, and then we performed a context analysis to bring everything together and see if there was a way to compound the information in a way that was actionable. We ran a set of co-design workshops with our partners and saw if there was a way to construct a method that could use what we found out during the desk research and put it to practical use. Then we enhanced it with a special effort on female participation, which was developed by one of our partners, and then we moved into drafting the model. So let's call it, we put together the building blocks of what a CWL activity should look like. And we discovered the project. We ran a training of the trainers in which we tried to give all these tools to the teachers that would then be involved in the pilot activities. We ran a small-scale pilot. We called them Learn to Learn. So we gave students and teachers, actually they gave themselves a bit of time to run a small-scale activity and see if everything worked. And then we ran the pilots proper, which were larger-scale activities with more complex storytelling and more moving parts, if I may say so. And then we're now in the process of fine-tuning the findings and define a proper structure, the definitive structure for the CREAM CWL. Now, how do we do this? And I'd like to start with a quote from William Butler Yeats, which is, "Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." And I very much believe so, being an educator myself. I can definitely relate with the concept of my role not being the one that fills my students' minds with information, but rather that tries to ignite a spark in them to go and find more themselves and find what they actually want to learn, what they're passionate about, or even just meet the things that don't necessarily interest them, but they can still face them and learn them because they've learned how to do that in a way that is not boring, but can be interesting, even if the subject is not exactly their cup of tea. So here are the basic elements of the CWL. We need an original idea. We need a problem. This links directly to problem-based learning and context-based learning. We need a STEM subject, which needs to be relevant to the problem or to its solution. We need a story, which is the locus where we embed the problem so that the solution to the story will then be the solution to the problem as well. We need a set of activities, so we need to have an idea of what exactly our students are going to have to be doing, and ourselves what we're going to be doing. And then we need a narrative, a narration at the end that summarizes everything. So from the beginning of the problem and to what the students found and what they concretely put together to show what the solution looked like. And of course you want the conclusion. So if you run this in a classroom setting, it's a good idea to have some sort of celebration at the end, some sort of event in which students have a chance to show their peers, or maybe the parents or the friends or the other teachers, what they have and progress they made and the physical product they managed to put together to show everybody what the solution was. This is a diagram with to a greater level of detail to explain exactly what the workflow looks like. So we start from a certain idea, which will be, for example, the title of your activity, or anyways like the core idea of what you want to do, and then from there you select a certain problem. The problem needs to be connected to a set of actions, that's your activity, and a story, which is the framework in which you embed your problem and the activity. So the activity will need, of course, to be to include a STEM subject and a set of details, which will be the task. So exactly what the students are going to be doing. The space, so is it going to take place inside, outside, in a lab, in the classroom, exactly where. The timing, which is very, very important. So how much time is allocated to a certain task or to the performance of a certain activity. The materials, so everything you need or that you might need if you have it already, if people need to provide it, if students need to make it, all these things need to be cleared, discussed. The involvement of external actors. So in some cases, not everything can be done by the teachers. Sometimes we need help from people that know more or that are more knowledgeable in certain fields. That's also something that should be taken into account. So, do we need to involve an external expert? Do we need to contact a museum or a library or a lab? That all depends on the sort of activities you want, and it all depends on the problem they need to solve. And then, of course, you will want to have a sort of properly scheduled set of events. So, the launch of your activity, the main bulk of the activity, the conclusion, and perhaps the feedback to see what went well and what could be done better. This is important because it gives participants a sense of proper organization and a sense of timing. So they know they're aiming to meet a certain date because that's the deadline. So, with regards to the problem, what you basically need to do is, problems need solutions, of course. So this can be delegated to the students, or you can arrange that yourself beforehand, which of these ways you want to go to. So you can have, set things up so that you need to select a solution among a certain set of solutions that you offer them. So students in this case will need to do something to find out which solution is the best, or which one fits better the task you gave them. Or they will need to devise a solution themselves, which is more complex, but it's also more fun. Or they will need to overcome a certain challenge. In that case, they will need to analyze the situation, the context, and design ways to overcome a certain obstacle. This leads to the solution and to the documentation. Documentation is important, primarily because it can be used, A, to show people what your students did, and B, because it can be used by themselves as tools to reflect on what they did and estimate what they could have done better, or vice versa, to demonstrate that they actually did very well and here's something to show for it. With regards to the story, stories are, well, they're potentially infinite, but they do share some basic elements. Now, we don't need to be screenwriters here, but just a very generic knowledge of the basic elements of storytelling and what elements a story requires would be very helpful here. So you are going to need a plot, of course. So what happens from A to B to C. You're going to need some characters, which are entirely up to you or your students to design and devise, depending on the story you want to propose. Certainly more than one, otherwise there is very little story. You're going to need a setting, which can be anything. It can be something in the past, it can be a setting in space, in science fiction, or it can be a steampunk, anything you want, or they want, depending on, again, the context and the problem. And then you're going to do the conflict. So then at a certain point, something needs to go wrong for a story to happen. So that's the point. Is it the world is in danger, or there's two major actors that are going to have a conflict over something, a disagreement, or something unexpected happens with the climate? Large scale, small scale, it's entirely up to you. And then, of course, you're going to need a resolution, which needs to be linked to the solution of the problem. So the idea basically is, when you solve the problem in the real world, you will also use that, or you will set that up to be the solution of your story, of the conflict in your story. And then all these things will going to have to be put together and narrated in some sort of way, which again is entirely up to you. It can be something visual, so it can be a set of pictures, it can be a video, it can be a video clip if you want to put music in there, it can be something published, so book, brochure, anything you want, or anything your students want to come up with, comic strips, anything. Then of course you'll have the conclusion, so you will show the interested parties, which can be classmates, friends, other students in the same school, parents. You set it up, you select that, you show them what all this activity, the storytelling, and the students' efforts led to. It's very important to have something reasonably well done, well documented, for your students to show and be proud of. So specifically about the idea, these are 4 suggestions we'd like to offer, and one is that it needs to be STEM related, because this is part of the setup. It needs to be embedded in a story, so that it makes sense and it keeps people engaged and interested. It needs to be solvable through STEM, so the options are never-ending, potentially. We just need to make sure that the solution can be mediated by the use of one or more STEM subjects. And of course, it needs to be fun. It's very recommended, because if it's fun and not just interesting and complex and difficult or whatever, if it's fun, then it's easier to keep the attention at a reasonably high level for an extended period of time. The problem itself, it needs to be linked to the activity. It needs to be linked to the STEM subject. So the solution to the problem, again, would need to be found, would need to be mediated by the use of one or more STEM subjects. And of course, it needs to be linked to the story. So as we said before, if you set this up properly, when you use the STEM subject or subjects, you run an activity that involves those subjects, you find the solution, and that solution would also be the solution to the conflict in your story. The activity itself, well, it needs a STEM subject, as we said, and a set of details, which are primarily your task or tasks. So a list of actions that will need to be performed in a certain sequence before the activity is completed. Details about location, so the place where the activity takes place, where it happens, about timing, about the materials needed. This is very, very important to avoid stopping the activity because you need to provide something you were not aware of or you didn't consider in advance, and potentially the involvement of external actors that will provide expertise that's not immediately available to either students or the teachers. Of course, you need the schedule, so you need to have, which doesn't need necessarily to be down to the last second, but it's very helpful to have at least a general idea of where you start, where you want to be halfway, and where you want to be at the end. It's a very good idea, as we suggested before, to keep documentation of the majority of these steps. So this can be, again, in the form of sketches, it can be notes, it can be recordings, it can be pictures, anything you want, so long as you can use it to keep a sort of log, like a book of days or a travelogue of the entire experience. And you can use that in the end to reflect on what you did and to show everybody what the process looked like. With regards to the story, you're going to need a plot, so what happens to whom and why. You're going to need characters, so the people that are involved in the plot, in the story, which can be as many as you want, but at least 2, my personal recommendation. You're going to need a setting. This is very, very important, depending on things like the activity you want to run, the students you're working with, the age groups. Some respond better to, say, a fantasy setting. Older students tend to be more receptive of stories set in a science fiction context, for example, or diesel punk or steampunk. Some others would prefer things set in a historical context or in a totally imaginary world. It depends on what you want to do with whom. You're going to have the conflict, which is very, very important. So what went wrong? What is the problem? What do we need to solve, right? And that solution, the solution to that conflict will be mediated by the activity, which is about the STEM subject. And that's it. So if you want more information, you feel free to get in touch with us. You can also you can go through the website and see the documentation available. There's a full set of deliverables that can give you more information and a better idea of what the whole process looks like and what you can do. And I will leave you with that. Thank you for your attention.